Welcome to Lifting the Lid on Technology, a podcast series brought to you by SoftSource in association with New Zealand's leading IT vendors and experts. I'm Barry White, VCIO Principal Consultant at SoftSource. In this series, we explore opportunities and challenges in the world of IT. Welcome to Lifting the Lid on Technology. This afternoon, we're talking about endpoint management and offensive versus defensive security and everything in between. And I'm joined this afternoon by our CTO, David Small, and Alex Warren, who is Senior Security and Software Development Specialist based in the deep, dark south of New Zealand in Christchurch. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Afternoon.
Yeah,
Hi, Barry.
Thanks for joining us. So I thought I'd start off this afternoon maybe with you, Alex, if that's all right, and maybe just tell us a bit about yourself, how you got into the security industry, and perhaps a little bit about your day-to-day role at SoftSource VBridge.
So originally I was a software developer, so lead developer for a very long time. As a part of that, there's a substantial amount of networking code and things like that that's written, which is somewhat tangential to security, and dealing with and investigating issues in that kind of piqued my interest in security. And then it developed from there. I ran a penetration testing consultancy for a while, and have been kind of doing security for quite a long time now. My day-to-day role at SoftSource VBridge is mostly penetration testing, with a little bit of advising and meetings and those sorts of things thrown in as well.
So we can call you a red teamer, can we?
You could, but that'd be super weird.
Hey, look, I'm really keen to. There's a lot of talk these days about sort of difference between offensive and sort of defensive tactics, and you're much more on the offensive side of the business. Maybe you could sort of talk to that as a bit of a theme, and maybe give us some living examples without naming their names, of course, but give some living examples of some of the experiences you've had recently firsthand.
Well, the first part of that, the difference between, or this occasional conflation of offensive and defensive security, they're not really related at all. Defensive security is exactly that. It's typically somebody that works in the organization and is setting up good practices, good tooling, all of these sorts of things to prevent an attack or to mitigate an attack once it happens, things like that. Offensive security is obviously the other side. That's what a hacker does or what a penetration tester emulates. And, while they're both working on security, there's very little that's similar in the way that they work or their approaches or the things that they do. In terms of their day-to-day things anyway, at some point there's going to be a shared understanding of certain issues, which is just necessary when you're looking to mitigate them. But the approaches and the foundation of that understanding is going to be completely different. A defender, like a system administrator, might have a vague idea about how cache deception works, for example, whereas an attacker may or may not have a really, really deep understanding of cache deception or zero understanding of cache deception. It doesn't actually matter. For me as an attacker, I just have to find one entry point into a system. So if I'm ignorant about cache deception, it doesn't really impact me. But if you're a defender and you're ignorant about cache deception, then the guy that's not me, that does know about cache deception, is still going to find that entry point. So the kind of consequences that you get and the kind of knowledge that those consequences necessitates is very different for a blue team or a red team person. It's the reason I like being the offender is I just have to find one entry point into your system to own your organization, right? If you're the defender, you have to find every entry point into your system to prevent me from owning your organization. And it's much easier for me from my perspective. And in terms of recent examples, it's too easy to think, because every example really is a case of this. Most reasonably hardened systems have maybe not an AppSec team, but they certainly have system administrators or IT managers that care about the security of their organization. at least to some extent. So every instance of owning an organization is me getting past the blue team. It is finding something that they haven't found or exploiting something they didn't think could be exploited.
So in terms of exploitations, and just maybe to put a bit of New Zealand context on that, are we dealing with the same sorts of problems that everybody else is dealing with throughout the world, or are there things that tend to skew more towards our market, given that we're likely more of an SMB market than a sort of a large corporation sort of environment?
There's definitely global differences in terms of the kind of attacks, the general level of defense that you see. But New Zealand kind of sits within a group of like countries in terms of the kind of attacks that target New Zealand businesses and the kind of standard of care, I guess you'd say, that we have in our organizations. So, here we see a lot of, publicly we see a lot of, say, ransomware or other things that sort of is just generally public, but we also have a lot of stealing money from trust, a reasonable amount of identity theft, credit card theft, things like that. And they all target businesses of all sizes, really. If your business, I think, has 20 business credit cards, I'll go and try and steal those. But, you might think, why wouldn't you target somebody that has 10,000 business credit cards? Well, you might, but they're going to be that much harder than the company with 20 credit cards. And if I think you're easy, why not just go for it and pick it up on the way? Maybe I can use those credit cards to buy some extra CPU to make it easier to get into that 10K company. But at the same time, we do still have quite a lot of high-value targets as well, especially for state-sponsored stuff, which people don't really think about. But some of our primary industries in particular are quite likely to get attacked by state-sponsored attackers. The dairy industry, for example, has definitely had some challenges in that regard.
Yeah. So you touched on a point that I wanted to ask you about there. So have you noticed, and again, putting that New Zealand context on it, have you noticed certain industries seem to be more prone to exploitations in New Zealand than others? And if so, what are they and why?
Maybe more prone is not quite how I would say it. Different industries seem to be more likely to get attacked in different ways. But there's definitely some big patterns. Logistics is just, it's almost a joke how frequently and normally how exploitable logistics companies are. Just something about the way they're dealing with a bunch of vectors that attackers really like to attack. So they're dealing often with user input. I want to put in a tracking number and get back information. They're also dealing with a lot of generated things based on user input, which is often just a really good attack vector. Like if you're printing PDF printing slips, most of the time I can use that PDF generator as a backdoor into your business. PDFs are complicated. But other industries as well, anything like healthcare or governments are always going to be targets for personal information theft. And any primary industry where being offline for a certain amount of time is going to create a lot of cost is a great target for ransomware. If I know you're going to be losing millions every day that you're offline, it seems fair to ransom you for one or two of those million. Right.
Just, I guess, for the benefit of people listening to the podcast today, everybody's sort of familiar with the term phishing, but there's also, smishing and vishing as well. And I don't know about you, but I've noticed a significant increase in certainly the last 12 months or so of smishing hitting my phone anyway. Is there a reason for that, do you think? And what are the sorts of things that people need to be careful of, and how can we help our staff, I guess, look out for these things?
Yeah, the reason is just it's profitable, right? You make a lot of money, so why wouldn't you do that, right? If I know there's no potential consequences and it makes me a lot of money, I'm going to do it, and that's generally what people do. There has been a bit of a rise. I think part of that is just because it's more known how effective it is, how much money you can make. It's a lot easier to launder money from those sorts of things these days. I mean, it's always been reasonably easy, but the tooling is just getting better and better. It's mostly automated, very little effort for a good reward. So why wouldn't you do it? I'd also note that, obviously you see a lot of stupid examples on your phone, like just low effort, like really bad. A package has been left for you at like Courier Sweden or something. Why? That's obviously wrong. But there are also people that will combine phishing and smishing or whatever attacks with client-side attack vectors on the actual websites. So I see a lot of attacks that are almost 100% successful, where you get, a spoofed email. So you might get an email from example.com. It looks like it's from example.com. And because they have a client-side vulnerability on their website, I give you a link that is to their website. And it's still a malicious link, right? But I'm exploiting a client-side vulnerability there. So the things people look for, like the sender's email and the domain of the link and all that sort of stuff, is all valid. And if that's coming from a company that you'd expect an email from, like a logistics company, it's very, very successful.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of them are getting more and more sophisticated and certainly a lot more convincing.
And those ones you don't normally spam out, right? Like if I find a CSRF vulnerability, I'm not going to send out a million SMSs. I'm going to take my time and send SMSs to people that are expecting an SMS from that company to maximize the benefit of that vulnerability. And I can get away with doing that because my return per capita is so much higher.
Can you talk a little bit about, and you sort of touched on that point a little bit there, I guess, in terms of the sort of tactics that some of these actors use, is that we're moving to a space where things are becoming much more sort of in the form of persistent attacks. And can you just kind of talk to that a little bit as the theme? Because people are probably familiar with malware, but they're probably less familiar with is perhaps the amount of time that some of these people actually invest into these. And you mentioned things being easy versus hard. Is are these attackers, do they tend to go towards the lowest hanging fruit? And if they, if it's something seems to be easier, that'll tend to be the path they'll take. I mean, how much time and effort do they put in, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
Well, some attackers put in a lot of time and effort. There's different kinds of attackers too, though, right? So there are some people that just don't have the skill set to do a really clever, persistent attack. And other people that send you those really bad SMSs. But if you've ever had, say, a credit card stolen and you have no idea how it got stolen, it was probably one of those other people, right? So the approaches, the effort, it's totally different between them. And most of the money goes to the highly skilled people. But, if you're in a country where, say, the median income is like $100 a month, it's very easy to get $100, even with minimal hacking abilities. And if that's coming from a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with the country that you're in, there's not really any risk to you. So those kind of attacks are common. That being said, what you're saying about persistent attacks, they're definitely quite common. They tend to be performed by people that really consider themselves to be hackers. They identify that way. So they perhaps take pride in what they do. They realize that they have a good niche skill set. And, that could just as often be intellectual interest that's leading them to choose a more hardened target, or an activist reason or a state-sponsored reason as well. All three are very common. And if you are getting targeted by a talented individual that's willing to spend months attacking you, that's a really scary situation. You need to. Ideally, you would identify that that's happening really early on, so you can take preventative measures before they get too far. Because if you're not actively hardening your perimeter and noticing those attacks early, they're going to get a foothold in your environment, and after a certain point, once they have a certain amount of control, you're realistically not getting them out. The unless they choose to leave out of boredom or because they felt they've killed the organization already, it's better to prevent that from happening at all. Yeah.
So what is the, and I've read different numbers around this, but I'm interested in your sort of real world view of this. I mean, what is the sort of average gestation period for an attacker in a network? Because, I guess the goal is to get in there undetected and to, once you're in there, to stay there, really, isn't it? Would that be a fair call?
Oh, it really depends a lot on what you like to do. So, for example, creating botnets was and is still very, very popular. The botnet's just a huge collection of computers that you control, and then you basically sell access. So we could be talking about 10,000, 100,000 computers, and then you'd sell access to all of those computers by the hour to other people. So in those cases, you might be holding on to a computer for 6 months before you sell access to it, and all of the other computers in that network. And then it really depends. So, we like to think of access as well as being that traditional, like, I popped to a web server, I got a shell right at the back of your organization, and I can control all of the computers, like a traditional remote code execution vulnerability. And those are very popular. It's also quite fun to do. You just feel as though you have a lot of power. But client-side vulnerabilities and a lot of applications are more valuable. And you'd be looking to hold on to those functionally permanently if you can. People call them 0 days. They've been exposed for 0 days. Nobody knows about them. And if you imagine Facebook, for example, or something like this, yes, getting access to the servers, very, very valuable. But all the data is probably going to be really well encrypted. They're probably going to find you. It's also quite stressful because they have some really good counter-hacking people on staff. They have a great AppSec team. But if I can find a client-side vulnerability that allows me to steal information from individuals that are using Facebook, the chance that your AppSec team finds it is minimal. But I can sell that and access to that vulnerability or to those people at a much higher rate for a lot longer. So, yeah, how long's a piece of string really depends on the situation. But the gestation period could be tiny as well. If I just want PXPay credentials and I want to steal the money that your thing's earning, I would try and get the credentials, in seconds if I can, and immediately start siphoning money.
Use an interesting word there. Use the word fun. And something, preparing for this podcast, I read the term of hacktivist versus a cyber criminal motivated by money. Reading suggests that the majority of these attacks are by these hacktivists or activists. Is that true in your opinion? Because the money side's increasing, but would that be your perception as well?
No, I would say most attacks are people that want money, but almost every hacktivist wants public acknowledgement. So if I want it to be known, or if I just want to tank your company's stock, then I'm going to make sure it goes public. I'm going to let you think you found me as well, right? So I can hack you again later and make it sound worse. Do you know what I mean? Like a hacktivist's motivation is just so different, and generally it's a bit scarier. I think businesses can understand somebody wanting money, but if somebody just wants to hurt you, that's a lot harder to deal with.
So if we just bring it back to I asked that question earlier about defensive versus offensive, and again, sort of bringing it back to sort of a New Zealand context. Do you think that most businesses, and again here in New Zealand, put far too much faith on their preventative sort of AV solutions, really, and despite all the media and the growth of cybercrime over recent years, do you think that's still true today?
Yeah, well, first off, I think probably most organizations don't even do that. So the companies that actually go so far as to get things like Defender probably do put too much faith in it. But I think most companies don't even do that. If I if I go and scan New Zealand for SSL certificates, I'd probably come back with about 283,000 New Zealand websites with Apex domains. If I try and look at what kind of preventative measures they have in place, like Akamai or Defender, whatever it is, I think you're going to find that a lot less than half of them actually have those measures in place. But yes, in saying that, the people that do have them in place often think, well, I'm invincible now. I have whatever it is, X application of the month. So it's all good. I don't need to worry about my security. I don't need to have a good code base or whatever it is.
That's interesting. That's probably a good segue to sort of bring David into the conversation as CTO. And David, you've been in the industry a long time, and you spent a lot of time looking at the sort of cybersecurity landscape here in New Zealand. Give us a little bit of a state of the nation here in New Zealand, David. Again, sort of my reading, preparing for today, sort of looks at across New Zealand, suggests there has been an increase in unauthorised access, for example, in New Zealand, but there has been quite a significant decrease in malware. But I'm just sort of interested in sort of your perspectives on that, and is it changing, and if so, why?
Oh, look, you've hit on phishing previously, that is an increase in the market, but we also see a decrease in that malware, even that ransomware has dropped away to our lower levels.
Why is that?
I think the target is now to get access and leak that data. If you've got the data, that's the gold. So we're seeing there's still a lot of money that can be made out of grabbing that data in the first place. And you just have to look at the recent attacks around the different medical groups, both here and Australia. They're not ransomwaring the data by encrypting it. They're taking the data and then going and selling it 10, 100 times over on the dark web for people to use for other attacks.
Yeah.
So it's that grabbing that privacy information about all the end users, all the data that they have, phone numbers, license, driver licenses, passports, all the core stuff that when you ring up the bank, they're the things they ask to prove who you are.
So for the purpose of people perhaps not, everybody knows the term the dark web, but maybe from a layman's point of view, maybe you could just describe what the dark web is, because people probably have this slightly fictional view of what it is, but in reality, what does that look like? And if you were to put that into words, and how do these people interoperate in that space?
Oh, Alex has probably got a better way of describing it, but my simplest version for people to understand it's like your marketplace, but it's controlled and accessed by a group of people that don't go to Google and aren't using public-facing systems to share information.
Yeah.
Your eBay of the dark web to buy credentials, etc. Yeah, it exists. And anyone can get there. They just need to know how to traverse the network. How would you describe it, Alex, in layman's terms?
Yeah, I'd say people conflate a few things. So there's like the traditional understanding of the dark web, which is just a website that's not indexed by a search engine, and the dark net, which is perhaps an underground network of some description. When we talk about things today, we tend to conflate various factors. So we might think of, say, a website that's hosted on a Tor node, so you need to use Tor to access it, and also happens to be something where you could buy like drugs or accounts or credit cards or something like this. But in reality, you see plenty of websites that you can just Google search for, like raid forums or whatever, which you can buy credit cards or Netflix accounts or whatever it is you want to buy. And we see plenty of Tor nodes that are just normal websites. So I think it's become blurry in recent years, but we do conflate the terms a little bit.
Yeah. Do you think most people would be horrified how much their data was out there? For your average Joe Blogs on the street.
Yeah, I mean, it does depend a little bit on the individual, but, Troy Hunt runs a great website, haveibeenpwned.com. You can go there and put in an email address, and it'll tell you if he has your password. And then if you go to another website, you can get that password or whatever other information that you might want.
Yeah. David, you might want to comment on that, because a lot of our customers may not be aware that we run a dark web monitoring service. Do you want to talk about that briefly in terms of what it is and how that works?
Yeah, look, we're doing the same sort of services, the services Alex has just mentioned, that we're using a partner to troll that dark web websites to look for those pawned passwords that are picked up and registered against customers' domain names. And then we're surfacing that up. And it might not just be passwords, it could be your personal information, so date of birth, personal details about you. It's collecting that. So it's anything around those companies' brands. And it's becoming more of a focus moving forward, is looking at how we build that out to then help customers understand how their brand's being affected out on the internet. Is there some exploit out there that's being talked about that company XYZ is available and can be hacked or owned through this exploit that someone's found? So it's surfacing that up. It's one of many bits of information that, if you know it's there, causes you to do more work on the inside to say, okay, how did they get that? Where did it come from? And doing that protection layer. It doesn't stop you, but at least it gives you an insight to what's out there.
Yeah. Have you ever seen anybody get a clean bill of health without gone through one of those?
No, normally there's quite a lot, and it's quite surprising sometimes what comes back around where people have used their corporate email address. Certain websites that may be used for personal gains and stuff, where they pop up, and it's like, yeah.
Also, LinkedIn's been popped like 4 times, and most of LinkedIn's databases are in there. So most corporations, at least from the LinkedIn pop, have credentials in there.
That's probably good, I guess, lead into talk a little bit about MFA, I guess, because it's, I guess that's one of the primary tools, I guess, out there that helps with, if people's credentials are compromised, then if somebody does have a crack, but I guess that's an extra layer. Again, if we put that New Zealand context around it, roughly what is the percentage of customers using MFA, say, on Microsoft 365?
It's hugely jumped forward in the last 12 to 18 months. I suppose it's a benefit of New Zealanders being forced to work from home due to a pandemic. It's forced businesses to think about that hybrid workforce and securing them, because they've moved all their data up into public clouds like Microsoft 365, and that's now available globally. It doesn't matter where you are versus being on the corporate network. So, yeah, we see that's a huge increase there. But there's so many people that still use those same passwords and same credentials for their corporate that they're using for their bank, their personal accounts, and they don't have MFA on them or two-factor authentication in place. So once you've compromised one and got some credentials, well, it's not hard to work through to get to the other things that are used by that user.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of MFAs that are not implemented properly as well. Oftentimes when it's done in-house, you can find a bypass for it pretty well. Just like simple things, like they don't realize that wildcarded or poor redirects make it so that I can steal tokens. Really see it often when they're using things like Facebook or Google, is that with that redirect, you can create a subdomain for those websites, so you can often just grab that token. And then a lot of companies are still just relying on SMS-based two-factor authentication, and it's not secure. It's better than nothing, but you should really be looking at like app-based two-factor or a hardware key or something like that.
Well, I see the latest stuff from the likes of Microsoft are now bringing in that it's location-based number back to the authentication or authenticator software. So it's not just you, your password and a key. It's you, your password, your location and a key. So there it's tracking all of them together to make up one token for you. So it makes it a little bit harder. But as Alex mentioned, there's so many people that go, I've got two-factor, but they're SMSing their key out, and it's so easy to be in the middle of that communication and own that.
So what I'm hearing is sort of, not all MFAs are the same. I guess there's different technologies that use different techniques and, different amounts of machine learning and other bits and pieces to put some intelligence behind that service as well. But I've read about exploitations also occurring around MFAs, like of this concept of MFA fatigue, for argument's sake, where hackers storm somebody's address and they get a whole pile of MFA messages on their phone, and they basically go decline, and the basis being that they'll occasionally hit the wrong button and they'll say accept when they don't mean to. I've heard of that as a technique that's been used a bit.
Yeah, that's a pretty lame technique, but there's cooler ones. I've had somebody where I had a Citrix multi-factor auth, and they just accepted it. They were without an exploit. I had their password, and they just clicked accept. It does happen, but there are quite a few different exploits, and there's things like simjacking attacks. So, if I'm really having trouble with an MFA, I can hire someone to go steal an iPad from like a telecom store and just steal your phone number, and then I'm going to get your MFA token. So if you're valuable enough, people are going to get around it.
Yeah, absolutely. So David, it's probably a good lead into maybe talk a little bit about sort of, MDR and some of the work we're doing in terms of endpoint management as well. And it's been a bit of a journey, I guess, as the market's changed and technology's changed over recent years as well. And I'm keen for you to kind of talk us through that journey a little bit. And we've launched some new services recently. And
look, we've been in the same areas or arenas that everyone else has, that we've gone down that track with antivirus products that do different components, be it starting off with simple signature-based systems, and has morphed into actually using some sort of machine learning. Most endpoint protection people or manufacturers turn around and like to talk about how they've incorporated AI and machine learning to pick up bad things happening. That's great, but as Alex has pointed out, if they're not configured well, no one's looking after them, then they're only so good. Someone who really wants to attack you or wants to get into your environment will do it eventually. Someone will click on a link that they're sending through. There'll be a hole or an exploit they'll find. They're going to get in. So as we've morphed through that process of growing that security stack out, and you've got the likes of Microsoft getting heavily into that security space with its Defender suite and Defender for Endpoint, we've looked at that and said, how do we help our client base become more aware of what's happening? Because today is not a will I stop them from getting in? It's when will they get into my environment from a cyber breach perspective. So it's how do we find them? How do we make sure they don't get in and make themselves comfortable? As Alex was mentioning, it's like once a person's in your environment, very hard to get them out again. So how do we pick up that they're there? And that's where the managed detection and response service has been built out over the last year or so, where we've partnered with a third party to help bring eyes on glass looking at your endpoint protection product using the Microsoft Defender to be looking and seeing what's happening. And it's not looking to say, hey, here's a bit of code that's trying to access these passwords, because the likes of Defender for Endpoint or CrowdStrike or any of the other high-end products can see that and they pick up on that. You don't need to do that heavy lifting, but it's where the cyber criminal comes in or attacker comes in and they've got into your environment, and then they're using tools that you would normally use or your service provider like SoftSource Verbridge may use to manage your environment to launch an attack. So that could be that they're using a valid remote control tool to remote into a device and then firing off some PowerShell to launch a hack that will gather some passwords. These are all things that you might have approved and allowed that service provider to do on your machines. And individually, they're not a cause for much concern. But when you pull those three things together, actually, I've used the remote control tool to get into your environment because it was exploitable. I've then used it to launch some PowerShell to give myself elevated credentials. I've now got credentials on the environment and I'm now traversing across your environment to 6 other machines. And I'm looking for that key data or those key bits of information I want to exploit out of you. And that's where our managed detection and response comes in. We have people with eyes on glass looking at those alerts as they come through, and they're making those correlations. Hey, here's this person that's RDP'd into a device on the network and they were outside the network when they did that. Is that a normal behavior for that user? Is that machine normal for that to be happening on? And they're correlating that up and building that up. So that human component, and I know people talk about AI these days, especially with the ChatGPT exposure recently. Is it going to do all this for you? There's still that correlation bit that if your AI doesn't know about it, it's not going to pick it up. And that's where the human component comes in.
So to put that in layman's terms, your traditional AV tools are really looking for known threats, if you like, that from a sort of database of biscuits built up over time. Whereas really here you're shifting more towards sort of behavioural science, aren't you? Is the behaviour of that, because they might be using tools that, as you say, in their present state are not really considered a threat at all. But it's the behaviour of the way those tools are being used, right?
It's the behaviour of those tools, but it's combining that intelligence of the antivirus or the endpoint protection product that's looking for those known exploits that are happening and being able to feed that in with a human sitting over the top using those artificial intelligent triggers that are bringing it through and telling you, hey, here's all the things that are launching right now. Oh, we can see these 3 things are launching across this machine. Actually, if we correlate that together, that's the same person doing something malicious. So it's combining the best of both worlds. You're getting the intelligence of machine learning or the known exploits and known attack vectors with a human looking over and marrying up a lot of this to say, okay, yep, that does look strange. Let me invest. Yes, okay, I can see these 3 things happening. Let me dig into, hang on, there's malicious, quick, let's take that machine offline. And they won't be able to get that footprint that Alex was talking about earlier because you're blocking them. And that's part of that hacker timeline where we're looking and inserting ourselves. Obviously, we can't start at the planning stage, but once they hit the environment, we're monitoring them as they step through there, trying to pick them up and collect them and then wrap them up and kick them back out of the network before they can do any damage.
Do you think it's true to say, and certainly it's been my observations in the corridors that I walk, that most New Zealand businesses probably don't have the capacity to really monitor these systems themselves. There's just too much data to keep an eye on. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, that is exactly what we see in the New Zealand market. And it's even offshore. You go to places like Australia, they struggle to keep up with the amount of traffic coming through the door. But it's not just that, it's even before that. We see it in New Zealand extensively, as was alluded to earlier, is we're not doing some of the basics. So you do multi-factor authentication, but have you done it correctly? Are you using the latest editions of it? Or are you using something that's 3 or 4 iterations back that's got exploits? If you, from internal machines, are you looking for vulnerabilities? Are you patching them? Are you doing all those housekeeping things we should be doing as good IT professionals? Or are you too busy chasing the targets that the customer wants or the business wants around giving us more productivity, be them dashboards, be them websites, collaboration sites? It's constantly being driven there, but we're forgetting the housekeeping, and that's part of it. It can be as good as your security product on the outside, but if you've got 54 exploits sitting on your web server, then someone like Alex is going to come and use one of those. As he says, he only needs one.
So in some ways, we're sort of overlaying a virtual SOC service over top of the endpoint manager toolset, right? So because most organisations are probably not big enough to justify having a SOC team in-house, right? They've probably only got one person, 2 or 3 people in their IT team, so it's too much to ask really for that person to do all of that, especially 24/7, right?
Yes, and due to the number of alerts or information that comes through, because you can think about a machine. If you've got one PC that's talking to 3 or 4 servers, the amount of information that's spewing out in an hour, and then you times that by 100 more people that you've got inside your organisation, you're just never going to keep up with that noise. You're going to ignore most of the alerts. So you're only looking for the critical ones and dealing with those, but it's those silent ones, and that's where the managed detection and response service comes in. It's looking across all of them. It is truly a SOC that's available 24/7 that's looking at your machines and your activities for you, just for anything malicious.
Yeah. Do you think IoT's making it a lot harder too? I mean, almost everything around us is hackable now. Is that becoming a problem as well with all these extra devices that are available? Printers, you name it.
It comes back to that. What are your vulnerabilities and how do you keep them patched? If the devices can be patched, then they'll be kept up to date. Alex has probably got a better view on how he would exploit IoT devices than me, but to me, they're devices we should be protecting on the network with that zero trust model, and we're not, where possible, keeping them updated with new firmware, new software as they come through. But Alex, your opinion on protecting?
It's like anything. If I can find it and I think I can exploit it, I'll have a crack. I mean, webcams are kind of traditionally, well, I guess, fun to take over because you get a visual on wherever you are, and they often lead further into the network. But my primary attack is still probably going to be web applications before I would start looking at IoT devices for a few reasons. Web applications are going to have more information that's valuable to me. They're going to have beefier computers behind them, so I get more CPU, and there's more attack vectors within them because they're more complicated. You know, if you've got an IoT temperature monitor thing, maybe that can be hacked. And I mean, there's been some pretty famous examples of like a casino got hacked from an IoT device in a lobster tank that led to some pretty serious damage. But normally I'd be looking at the more complicated, ideally complicated stuff that an organization's forgotten about before I'd start moving on to the IoT things, with some exceptions. You know, Hikvision cameras have just had a lot of problems in the past. So if I see one, I definitely want to try a couple of payloads before I move on to a different thing. But yeah, that'd normally be slightly lower priority for me as an attacker than the nice complicated web applications. But it's still definitely an attack vector. And also, they tend to be very easy to attack in an automated way. It's very easy to make templates and things to just scan the entire internet for them. If I'm a real specialist in hacking X temperature monitors, I'll just scan the entire internet for every single one and try my attack on every one of them. So if you do have an IoT device that's vulnerable, the chance that it will get hacked if it's on the network is almost 100%, whereas a web application can sometimes skate by without getting noticed.
Actually reminded me of a question I was going to ask on the websites, public-facing websites in particular. When we listen to the media and you hear stories of organisations being compromised, invariably it's their website that seems to be the culprit. What are the things that particularly New Zealand businesses should really be thinking about there, and what is the common mistakes that seem to be occurring out there? And why do websites get hacked so easily?
Perhaps the main reason is that it's so easy to associate it with your company. If your company is SoftSource and I see a website at softsource.co.nz and I want to hack you, then I know that I can attack that, right? Versus I think, David Small is the CTO of SoftSource. If I can hack him, that would be a good end of the organization. That's true. But I need to work out his IP address or maybe where he lives and all these other things. So it's kind of a bit more hassle just to begin with. So it's a very direct attack vector. Then there's the problem that web applications and websites are generally vulnerable. They have a lot of input from the outside world. You can often create an account, do a search, upload a photo, do all sorts of things to them. And this just creates more attack vectors for someone like me. And then we also see that even when people fix things that they perceive to be mistakes, they don't fix them well enough, and the vulnerabilities are still there. Every time I see something on the news where some website's been hacked in New Zealand, I go and look at the website after they fix it. It's still vulnerable, right? Because they fix this tiny little thing. So, there's a whole bunch of factors, but it's just a very obvious attack. It's very easy. And then also there's often forgotten parts of them, so you might have www.yourcompany.co.nz, which you know about and you try and patch it, but you've also got legacy.yourcompany.co.nz that you haven't looked at for 10 years. And you think that because it's segregated, that's going to protect you in some way. But I think differently. I think because it's segregated, all of those tools you install probably aren't running there. And that because it's segregated, you're not doing anything to protect it. So I get a nice private little box in your network to work from.
Anyway, look, thank you both for your time today. Really appreciate it. It'd be great to have you both back on again at some stage. Really enjoyed talking to you and really appreciated your insights. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Barry.
Take care. See ya.